Political and economic change. First of all, I just want to give credit to Ms. Silverman, who has been teaching political or comparative politics for quite some time. I am using her PowerPoints. They are based off of Ethel Wood's, what I would call the Bible for comparative government. So part one is going to be political and economic change. So we're going to be talking about reforms, revolutions, and coups, and what kind of conditions have to be present in a country for such things to occur. Okay. So political and economic change occur together and often influence each other. So if you have political change, but you don't see economic change that goes along with that political change, that's going to have tensions and have serious consequences. An example of this would be when you had Deng Xiaoping create a lot of economic changes in China. There was a lot of pressure for the government to institute political changes as well. And so far, the CCP of China refuses to have political changes in addition to the opening of their markets. Types of changes. You have reform. Okay. Reform, you want to change something, you want to change the methods and the politics or the economics of your country, and these are things that the political leaders see that society really likes or wants to happen too. So you don't have an overthrowing of the basic institutions of government. You may want to change some business practices in order to preserve competition in your country, a real capitalist economic system. You may want the government to be more proactive in preserving natural environment for this. And that doesn't mean that the government has to be overthrown, because the government is going to do this and respond to pressures from society. You have revolution. Revolution can be a major revision or an overthrowing of basic institutions. So, of course, in America, we had a revolution where it was a huge political change. It was a change of a political system, and it also changed our economy and our societal practices in the United States. Then you have something like the Industrial Revolution, which changed the economies of Europe and eventually changed the political system and the way that we look at social classes throughout Europe. Usually revolution is going to have a major impact in more than one area. So like the Industrial Revolution, you had first a change in the economic system, which is going to end up changing the political system. Coups. Coup literally means blow to the state. So this is the most limited of the three types of changes. You don't see this a lot. They're going to typically occur in countries where government institutions are weak and leaders have taken control by force. So there's like a power vacuum, and potentially new leaders, particularly like you see it a lot with military leaders, see that there's a power vacuum or that the current political system is vulnerable, and they take advantage of that. So you use force often by military. And you'll see coups most often in Nigeria. So where Nigeria attempts to have democracy, and because of ethnic divisions, it's difficult for the new leaders to maintain control. They are going to be vulnerable to military leaders overthrowing their leadership. Okay, attitudes towards change. You have radicalism. Radicals tend to be the leaders of the revolution. You have rapid and dramatic changes, and you abruptly replace the current system with something that the leaders perceive as better. We'll look at Russia's revolution in 1917, where the old Tsarist regime was replaced by the communist USSR, Lenin's Bolsheviks. Also, you see this radical idea of change in Iran in their 1979 revolution. Okay, liberalism. Okay, this is not the same as liberal Democrats in the United States. Liberalism, people who support the idea of liberalism want to see governments reform and change their practices, but don't want to overthrow the institutions. Conservatism tend to see change as very disruptive. They don't want to undermine the legitimacy of the state or the regime. So a conservative, again, not the same as conservative Republican necessarily, but they don't want to see a lot of change. They're not comfortable with that. Reactionaries oppose revolution and reform, but also don't want to see status quo. So they want to turn the clock back to an earlier era. You might be familiar with the term "Make America Great Again." That some people believe that when some small faction of people who voted for Donald Trump wanted to reinstate a political, social, and economic era that benefited white males, that would be a reactionary. So they want to turn the clock back to an early era. They're similar to radicals, but like radicals, they're more willing to use force and violence than liberals and conservatives. So radicals want to completely change the system. Reactionaries want to change the system back to what it used to be, and the two R's are willing to do it by force. Okay? When you are right, you cannot be too radical. When you are wrong, you cannot be too conservative. So that is a quote from Martin Luther King, obviously. Okay. Then we got to play into how does the development of democracy look? All right, so democratization also often accompanies a liberalization or an opening up of your economic system. Okay, now let's break this down. So democratization and moving towards market economies where the government isn't making economic decisions as much as supply and demand or the free market. This is going to indicates growing commonalities among nations. Okay, so democracy takes many forms. One broad essential requirement is the existence of competitive elections, free, fair elections. So in the AP6 that we study, Russia and Nigeria are kind of in that gray area of democratization because they have elections, but there's been questions about whether they're free and fair. Then you have liberal or substantive democracies where you do have competitive elections where civil liberties are protected, rule of law is protected, an independent judiciary is protected, open civil society where interest groups can try to influence the political party or the political process, and you have a civilian control of the military. In illiberal democracies, you may on paper have democratic procedures in place, but they have significant restrictions. You may have rule of law, but they're not always enforced by those who are in power. You may have checks and balances or separation of powers, but presidents have centralized or concentrated the power in their branch. You may have elections, but you know that the other parties or the third parties are not going to be able to win. And then you have rival and ethnic cultural politics, which is going to represent fragmentation, and that's going to be common in Nigeria. Okay, so this is a review All right, democratization is the spread of representative governments to more countries and the process of making governments more representative. So, elections. Again, talked about the transformation process from non-democratic regimes to illiberal or procedural democracies. That's kind of like the first step, is that you test out how democracy works, but it might be more controlled by one particular leader. To where we are and where the UK is, or where the US and the UK is, to a liberal substantive democracy. What must be present to qualify as a procedural democracy, and what must be present to qualify as a substantive democracy. Oops, sorry, I shouldn't have gone forward, my bad. To have a procedural democracy, you're going to, again, have democratic procedures in place, but they're going to be restricted. You're going to have rule of law, but they're not always, but it's not always followed. Substantive, you're going to have actual free and fair elections. You're going to have an open civil society. You're going to have civilian control of the military, and you're going to have an independent judiciary, and you're going to have true system of separation of powers and checks and balances. So procedural, think about it as more of like what's going on in Nigeria, but Nigeria is hopefully transitioning to a substantive democracy. Procedural democracy would be what they have in Russia. And Russia is actually moving more towards an authoritarian or soft authoritarian regime. Substantive is going to be the United States and the UK. So substantive is like a very liberal, established democracy.